Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you, Claudia. Okay. This mic, I move around a lot, so this might cause a bit of a problem, these pillars, but bear with me. So this is not going to be the best presentation in the conference. I know it's early, but I should be very clear about that. I'm not going to talk about new great ideas. I'm not going to talk about how to speak to millennials. I don't know anything about that. What I'm going to talk about or argue is that there is a massive danger coming. There's a massive warning that we should all be aware of, because everything that you talk about in this conference may not happen. That's my argument, and the argument of what needs to change and why the younger generation needs to act and kick the older generation. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about for about 15 minutes. So I'm going to give you a very brief history of the world to make this argument clear of kind of what's going on. I'm going to explain the history of the world by nature of geological epochs, an epoch being a great transitional time in history. So if we look at this, the Hadean period, 4.5 billion years ago, transformed into the Archean period, the first oxygenating bacteria, the Neoproterozoic period, when the first animals arrived, 400 million years ago, the first jawed fish. Anyone know that? No, okay. It's early in the morning. I can go with you on that. Animals came out of the sea in the Carboniferous period, and that's 300 million years ago. Jurassic Park, who hasn't watched Jurassic Park? Okay, it's all true. Everything is true. 200 million years ago this was happening. 7 million years ago, only 7 million years ago, we saw the emergence of mammals, which we kind of see today, such as the horses haven't changed too much. And then we get to the Holocene period. And scientists all thought, this is going back a couple of years ago, that we were now living in the Holocene. The Holocene period, the stable period from the Ice Age up until today. But increasingly, scientists are telling us this is not the case. We have moved into a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene. And if you just look at the time scale there, 4.5 billion years ago to just 50 years, a transition in 50 years ago to a new geological epoch. This geological epoch is summarized by something which we term the Great Acceleration. You can see the graphs here. The Great Acceleration is essentially a term where everything in the last 100 to 50 years is increasing. Okay? You can see on there, I think you can see the increase in motor vehicles, you can see the increase in tourism, you can see the increase in telephones, you can see the increase in McDonald's restaurants. All, some would argue, some good things. But you will also see an increase in some pretty scary stuff here. You can see an increase in population, you can see an increase in carbon, you can see an increase in biodiversity loss, in ocean acidification. Effectively, what is happening in the Anthropocene is that the world is on a precipice of absolute destruction. And the reason for this, or one of the key reasons for this, is that my thing stopped working, but I guess you can start at some point, that companies, the power of companies are driving us through the Anthropocene. The power of, companies are massively powerful. The size of Walmart is the equivalent to the size of Norway's GDP. Apple, I read this the other day, Apple have got more cash than the US government. It's pretty crazy stuff going on. Some scary facts for you. Every hour, 300 football pitches of primary rainforest are destroyed for palm oil. We've lost 50% of the orangutans in 10 years. 1/5 of all carbon produced is coming from 5 companies. Okay? Driving global warming. So this is scary stuff. And it's also having a big impact on society. This is a report, I don't know if you guys saw this, but a report from Oxfam came out last year, which suggested that 8 people, so enough effectively to sit on this buggy, have the same wealth as 50% of the world, which is phenomenal. Business is not serving society. And if you look, I mean, we're here talking about millennials. If you look at youth unemployment around Europe, this is a positive presentation to start the day, isn't it? I'm just sorry about that. It will end with some positivity, I hope. 50%, what's an increase? 48% was the last figure in Greece of youth unemployment. 20% of young people in France are unemployed. 41% in Spain, similar to Portugal and Italy. So the corporate community is effectively driving environmental destruction and driving society to its knees. And my argument is that corporate responsibility, a fairly new concept, has a lot to blame for this. Corporate responsibility is in many ways shielding companies from all of this destruction and all of this damage. And it's a very dangerous place to be. And there's some really good examples, I think. When you look at the FTSE for Good index, So the FTSE for Good, listed on the UK stock market, sponsored by the Financial Times, which I think this is sponsored by the Financial Times as well, isn't it? I'll be relatively careful then. So the Financial Times talks about the FTSE for Good. It talks about good companies, 50 great companies. But in the FTSE for Good, you have organizations like BHP Billiton, the mining conglomerate, most recently in the news for a dam that broke in its mining operations and killed 20 people and caused the biggest environmental destruction ever in Brazil. This is classed within CSR as a good company. And it's no better on the other side of the pond. The Dow Jones Sustainability Index, again, a list of those good companies, includes everyone's favorite, Monsanto. Monsanto, famous most recently for creating the Terminator seed, which you can only plant once, and afterwards it becomes infertile. So farmers in India particularly, where suicide rates have tripled because of this, are facing starvation because of this occurrence. So, effectively, this is a really interesting quote, I think, which sums it up. This is from Paul Hawken, who is a key ecologist and environmentalist. His view is that if every company on the planet were to adopt the best environmental practice of the leading companies, the world would still be moving towards sure degradation and collapse. Okay? So even the best businesses are not doing enough. Even the best businesses are driving through. And if you think about the kicking that I think the next generation should give us, I think there's a really strong case to say the kicking is coming because we are now really starting to see in our day-to-day lives evidence of this. So 50% of the bee population has collapsed. So in the US, instead of nature ensuring the recreation of flowers and plants, bees are being shipped around the US because they've been there are hardly any bees in California, so they're being trucked across the states so they can pollinate. In the UK, we've lost 50% of our wild bird population since 1970. And again, I don't know, you can see that and you can feel that. And this is York. That pub is in there because my dad used to go to that pub. So it's very special to him and was very special to him and very special to me. This was in York a few years ago, flooding that has not been seen on this scale. And if you think about where we are in London, you may have seen the Paris Accords. You may have seen the commitment from governments to keep the global temperature below the 2-degree threshold. Okay? So every government saying, yes, we will do this. It's important for you guys to know that is highly unlikely to happen. It's virtually impossible to keep below 4 degrees. And just thinking about where we are now, on the left side here, this is London. This is if we increase by 1.5 degrees. And this is obviously flooding. So we get a fair amount of flooding. This is if you reach the Paris Accords, which is 2 degrees. That's the flooding you're going to get in London. Much more likely, 2 degrees, is the 3 degrees. Not the band. 3 degrees increase in global warming. And then you get to 4 degrees. That is what is going to happen in London. There's a virtual certainty that this is going to happen because the governments of the world will not take the decisions that we need to take to get below that threshold. 2 degrees, 4 degrees. Okay? This is no longer speculative science. Whatever Donald Trump and his right-wing associates say, we're on the edge of this. And the millennium generation are going to be living with this, as are we. And then the final point to really cheer you up, the Syria civil war. We've been looking at this for about 10 years, the fact that climate change is going to be the cause of conflict around the world. It is strongly argued that the Syrian civil war was caused by climate change because communities moved in places they hadn't moved to before because of the drought, and conflict occurred. So again, we're seeing this now, and it is a very, for me anyway, within my work at the Body Shop, I think corporate responsibility has a lot to answer for. Because we as an industry, and my industry effectively, are covering this up. And we are saying, yes, we're doing really well, we're a great CSR citizen. But actually, all we are doing is making things a little less bad, but not good. However, I do think there is hope. And this is the uplifting bit, relatively uplifting. There is one principle that I think every company has to adopt. And there are 3 steps in which I think every company has to take if we are going to save the planet. because I think it is that serious. The first principle, this is a fairly famous paper by a guy called Rockström from the Stockholm Institute, who talked about planetary boundaries. That is, the red is where the planet is effectively overshooting its ability to regenerate itself. My argument is that every business needs to gear itself to operating against what the planet needs, not what business needs. That's the first principle. There are 3 steps I believe that companies need to take in order to do this. Step 1 is to embrace what we describe as the 4 conditions for a sustainable world. So there's 4 brief, I hope you can see them okay. There's 4 conditions based on science. These all come from the scientific community. These principles effectively can deliver a sustainable world. They can turn back, slowly, admittedly, what the problems are that we have seen. So that's the first thing. Businesses need to embrace those 4 conditions. Secondly, they need to embrace the idea of backcasting. Most of us are familiar with forecasting. Forecasting is when you look to the future based on the current situation and you project the present into the future and say, okay, based on my knowledge of today, we are going to go from here to here. There is an alternative. The alternative is backcasting. The alternative with backcasting is that you embrace those 4 conditions of sustainability. You say, right, my company is going to deliver all of those 4 conditions. And I'm going to set a goal, maybe it's 20 years' time, and I'm going to work backwards from that goal. I'm not going to take the problems of the present to the future. I'm going to backcast, envision a beautiful future, and then build my strategy from there. And that is the 3rd step. Build a plan based on the 4 sustainable principles, based on the concept of backcasting. And I think that unless companies do this, and this is not speculation anymore, unless companies do this, the Earth will not recover. And this is, I guess we're talking about millennials today, and I guess many of us know kids. I have kids, I know kids. Unless business leaders today, from our generation, I'm 40, I often forget, it could be 42, it could be 43, I don't really know. I'm old enough to forget how old I am. For my generation, from the directors of companies, they need to act. And they need to change, and corporate social responsibility needs to change. Otherwise, the kicking that we are going to get, and rightfully so, from the next generation, I think will be deserved. Okay, and that's all I wanted to say to you. I hope that's clear. I hope that's not too depressing for the moment. It looks terribly miserable. It is bloody miserable. It is a real challenge. But I guess there are some millennial, I don't know what a millennial is. I mean, people look at you guys as sort of like Planet of the Apes, or these things that people don't understand. The job, I think, of the young people today is to kick the boards, and it is to speak up and say, stop businesses being a little less bad. Be good. Okay. Thank you.